I'd like to speak on this topic of expanding our circle of compassion. So expanding our circles of compassion. One of the things that I found myself doing a lot in the last couple of years, especially since the last election, and a little bit beyond before that, but especially since then, is playing the role of cultural therapist, helping progressives and liberals especially to come to terms with the fact that things are not going to progress in an easy, comfortable way forever. In fact, I did a sermon a month and a half ago in Ludington, Michigan, where Connie and I spent the summer. And it was one of the more controversial, but also one of the most watched sermons that I've delivered, called Confessions of a Recovering Progressive. Because for most of my life, I was born in 1958, for most of my life, progress, human-centered progress, was just the expectation. Of course things are getting better and better. I've got it better than my parents had it. They had it better than their parents had it. My kids are going to have it better than me, and so on. There was this sense of inevitability from the caves to now to the stars. I had a Star Trek vision of the future. Very high-tech, very high-intensive energy. I didn't understand energy. I didn't understand that we have burned through the easiest, most affordable, and most dense concentrated energy, and we're now into the dirtier, harder to get, much more expensive stuff. And unfortunately, there's nothing in this solar system that's more compact energy than petroleum. So as it declines, which it already is, we will see a declining of complexity and a shrinking of economies. And I didn't get that. In fact, I denied that for a long, long time. And if the word compassion means to suffer with, and that's what compassion means, suffering with, we're going to have no shortage of opportunities in the coming years, the coming months, coming years, and coming decades, those of us who live that long, to extend our circle of compassion, to extend our sense of sanctuary, where we be sanctuary for others. In fact, others sometimes that don't even see the world like we do. And so what I want to do in this brief sermon is to talk about 8 basic human needs that all humans have had for all time in all cultures. These are widely considered now to be cultural universals. That is, all humans have needed these 8 basic needs. And when these needs are not met, we often individually and sometimes collectively, on the downside of civilizations, as civilizations contract, one of the things we know is 32 times in the history of humanity over the last 6,000 or 7,000 years, city-based civilizations have become great over 1 to 3 centuries, and then their own greatness, their own hubris becomes their own undoing, and they wipe out the forests and the topsoil gets washed away, and the civilization contracts. And we've seen 32 examples of that. We're the 33rd. And we are a good 40 years into catabolic collapse. That's what the Rust Belt is. That's one of the reasons why President Trump will never be able to make America great again in the way that he wishes or hopes, because we don't have the dense, concentrated energy as we did in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so how to deal with contraction, how to be progressives when the idea of perpetual progress is no longer credible in the same way that we held it. So here are 8 basic human needs. And I first learned about this. There's a colleague and friend of our new friend, old colleague, Dave Pollard, who wrote a piece called Cultural Acedia, when we can no longer care. See, when these 8 needs, when some of these needs are not being met, people start numbing out. Here they are. The need to belong to and connect with a safe and engaging community. starting with attachment to one's mother in the first years of life. Number 2, the need for meaning and purpose in one's life, including meaningful work. The need for meaning and purpose in one's life, including meaningful work. 3, the need to be valued, appreciated, and heard. The need to be valued, appreciated, and heard. Number 4, the need to be optimistic about the future for oneself and one's loved ones. Number 5, the need for control and a degree of autonomy over one's life and one's work. 6, the need to be regularly and closely in touch with the living world, the natural world. 7, the need for a sense of place and home. And 8, the need for freedom from chronic stress, financial, physical, whatever, and time and space to recover from stress, including getting adequate sleep. Now, one of the first things to know about these 8 needs is that none of them are even adequately addressed, much less fed or met in modern industrial civilization. 10,000 years ago, we had, in tribal cultures, indigenous cultures, First Peoples, cultures that lived sustainably for the first 98, 99% of human history, all of these were met in every sustainable culture for which we have evidence. This is what evolution has prepared us for. This idea that we are an immature species and we're just now growing up, no, it's not that. That's human-centered. It's New Age nonsense wrapped up in hyper-rationalist drag. What we are called to do is reclaim the wisdom of living in a right relationship, a mutually enhancing relationship with the air, the water, the soil, and the life upon which we depend. We now have an economic system that doesn't do that. We have an economic system that rewards the few at the expense of the many, measures progress by how fast we can take the biosphere and turn it into pollution, and forces billions of us to betray the future just by pursuing the so-called good life. Now, whether you call that kind of an economic system insane, unsustainable, or evil doesn't matter. It doesn't have a future. So how do we stay inspired to wake up and do the work that we can do? How do we stay awake to the grief that we're all going to experience? In fact, one of my favorite quotes from a death worker, Stephen Jenkinson, he says, "To awaken in our time is to awaken with a sob." He says, inattention to the world's needs is advisable, because attention to the world's needs mitigates against our happiness and contentment. We are in a difficult time. And in difficult times, our hearts of compassion can expand, but as this warns us, also because of cultural acedia, we can numb out. And so one of my great mentors, Joanna Macy's work, has always been about helping people to stay present to the real bad news. Open our hearts so we feel our profound interrelationship and interconnection with all of life, and then to engage in what she calls active hope, which is building community, nurturing time with the living world, making sure that you get enough sleep. You know, it's some of the basics here that we can take on ourselves. And one of the most important things that we need to do as liberals and progressives, and I realize that's probably not everybody, but the vast majority of us would feel comfortable with the label liberal progressive. And so one of the spiritual traps that we have to avoid is the trap of failing to recognize that civilizations have a life cycle, unsustainable civilizations have a life cycle. They become great, and then hubris. I love the ancient Greek definition of hubris. The overweening pride of the doomed. The overweening pride of the doomed, right? So unsustainable civilizations have this life cycle because they don't treat primary reality as primary. And whether you call the biosphere the goddess, or God, or nature, or Gaia, it doesn't matter. We need to relate to the living world as primary. We are derivative. We emerge out of the body of life. See, it turns out that religion in sustainable societies, stable societies, played the essential role that no other institution can play. In fact, it wasn't even called religion. It was life-based. And the fundamental role of religion is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present. But we need to treat primary reality as primary or we will perish. It's like, think nesting dolls. You know, like Russian nesting dolls? Subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. Every level, all of that is primary reality. We're in the middle somewhere. We're made up of microbes, for example. You have bacteria inside of you that you wouldn't last a day if they weren't doing what they're doing. We're all that way. And we rely on trees and algae for oxygen and the body of life, and food. So we rely on other aspects of reality. So human-centeredness is self-destructive. And yet we have a human-centered economy, human-centered politics, human-centered economics, human-centered religion. The cult of the individual. It's all about my salvation, my enlightenment. And indigenous cultures have known, no, it's about circling, as Einstein said, it's expanding our circles of compassion to include the entire living world, so that we are no longer anthropocentric, we're no longer human-centered, we're life-centered. We're ecocentric. That's why I say ecology is my theology. In fact, here's my creed in a nutshell. Reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And a just and healthy future is my mission. And I suggest to you that those 6 points unite tens of millions of secular religious people around the world. Now, atheists, humanists, and free thinkers don't feel comfortable with the God talk. They might say, reality is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is the main way reality is revealing itself, and so on. And I found that those on the conservative end of the religious spectrum tend to feel more comfortable like this. My God includes reality. My scripture includes evidence. My theology includes ecology. But this basic shift from human-centeredness to life-centeredness, whether we use secular or religious language for that, and both are legitimate, that's our only way to the future. I sometimes think of it as the prodigal species. One of my favorite quotes from Robert Louis Stevenson, he said, sooner or later we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. And we are now collectively, we're entering the age of consequences. And we are about to experience, we're already in the middle of, or in the beginning of, the Great Reckoning. And it's not because some supernatural deity who lives outside the universe and off the planet is pissed off at us and punishing us. No, it's because there are consequences when we live out of right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, and inescapably real. Namely, the living world. So that's the Great Reckoning. But it can also be the Great Homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species, after squandering our inheritance, we're waking up to our predicament, in the pig pen, as it were, and coming home to reality, coming home to life, whether we use secular or religious names for that. And again, both are legitimate. So I think I'd like to conclude with citing what I consider to be groups of people especially deserving of compassion and generosity. Poor people, communities, and nations who will suffer the most from climate and ecological breakdowns, yet who contributed the least to its main causes. Those of us feeling the loneliness of having to navigate our own downshifting expectations, whilst family, friends, and maybe even spouses are still in denial. Individuals, couples, children, families, and communities of our fellow social and mammalian species who generally feel and suffer just like we do. Techno-optimists and free market fundamentalists who will remain in denial the longest and be hardest hit financially and emotionally when reality bites. I used to be a techno-optimist up until just about 6 years ago. I believed that technology was going to be our savior. And then I started studying human-centered technology. Only technology that mimics the living world is sustainable. Technology that's human-centered, that benefits humans but harms the living world, leads to our destruction. And probably 95% of our technology does that. That's why our technology needs to come home to the living world. I think also especially deserving of compassion and generosity are people like us, religious, political, and social liberals and progressives whose faith in the religion of perpetual progress is currently being shaken, shattered, or even abandoned. And then those on the other side of the aisle, religious conservatives and evangelicals whose faith in the Bible has blinded them to what reality has been revealing through evidence for centuries about our inner, outer, social, and moral nature. And thus, they struggle disproportionately with addiction, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, depression, suicide, and sin in general. Two of my great heroes in my life are Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And they are because they faced systemic injustice. They faced institutional evil from hearts of compassion. They loved the enemy. They loved the oppressor. And that ultimately is the only thing that can bring, or mostly the only thing that can bring people into an expanded consciousness. So when we relate to our friends, our family, our neighbors, and others who have a different worldview, who vote differently than we do, who have different values, recognize that when these 8 basic needs are not met, and in this culture, they're not met for 99% of us, or almost all, including the very, very, very wealthy. When these needs are not being met, and it's not true just of humans, even other species, other mammalian species, when these needs are not being met for them, we see violence, we see hoarding behavior, we see addiction, we see depression. And so we can have compassion even for people who have very different worldviews than us and who vote very differently. Because the spiritual trap of progressives is to forget that and simply judge other people as being racists, sexists, thisists, thatists, and it's true. And yet if we allow ourselves in compassion to step into why is that person feeling and voting and thinking and fearing and judging the way they are, because their needs are not getting met just like the rest of us, we can find our hearts opening with compassion even to people that we never experienced before as in-group, and we may not still experience them as in-group. But we can win them, some of them, into a broader consciousness, a deeper heart, a greener heart, by having compassion rather than righteous judgment. And so that's what I think life is calling us and empowering us to do, is to expand our circles of compassion and to be the change